The old man was 73 years old, and he was crying in front of a courtroom that had never once seen him show weakness. His wrists were in handcuffs. His empire was seconds from being taken apart forever. And the only person who could stop it was a woman he hadn't spoken to in 10 years, walking through the doors right now, holding a single red folder against her chest. 25 years ago, he found her standing alone in the middle of a demolition road, holding a rusted lunchbox, refusing to move for his convoy. Today, she's the only reason he might survive this. Before we go back to that road, and that lunchbox and everything that came after it, if you're the kind of person who loves stories like this, stories about family, loyalty, and the people who surprise us most, do me a favor to like this video. There's a lot more waiting for you on this channel, and I promise it's worth sticking around for. And hey, if you're new here, welcome. Consider hitting subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a click. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop in the comments. It always surprises me how far these stories travel, and I like knowing who's out there listening. All right, let's get back to that road. He built the most feared criminal empire in the country. Grown men lowered their voices just walking into his office. And right now, he's standing in a courtroom in handcuffs, watching everything he ever built get taken apart piece by piece. But he's not thinking about the empire. He's thinking about a road that doesn't exist anymore, and a little girl who once stood in the middle of it, refusing to be afraid of him. Her name was Naomi, 8 years old, homeless, holding a rusted metal lunchbox like it was the only thing in the world worth protecting. And when his car surrounded her, she didn't beg. She asked him one question instead. "Are you the man everyone is afraid of?" He said yes. She said, "Good. Then you're the one I've been looking for." Inside that lunchbox was a secret that could destroy everything his family had built, and a truth someone had already tried to kill her 3 times to bury. He adopted her that night, not out of kindness, because keeping her alive had suddenly become his responsibility. 25 years later, she walked back into his life at the exact moment he needed her most, carrying evidence she'd spent a decade building, in complete silence, while the entire world believed she had abandoned him. The courtroom smelled like cold coffee and old paper, and Kang Do-hyun stood in the middle of it wearing handcuffs he had never once, in 73 years, expected to wear. His hair had gone the color of ash long ago, but he had spent decades making sure no one ever saw him look small. This morning, in front of cameras and strangers and men who had once called him family, smallness was the only thing left to him. 2 guards flanked him at the defense table. Across the room, a prosecutor was already reading from a stack of paperwork thick enough to end a man's life twice over. The judge's hand rested near the gavel with the patience of someone who already believed the outcome was settled. Do-hyun was not thinking about the empire collapsing around him. He was thinking about a road that no longer existed, in a district that had been demolished years ago, and a little girl who had refused to move out of the way of his car. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. The particular kind of turning that happens when something unscripted enters a room built entirely around scripts. A woman walked in. She moved the way people move when they've already counted 1,000 times over exactly how many steps it will take to reach the front of a room. She wore a deep navy suit, her hair pulled back from a face the cameras hadn't caught yet, and she carried a single red folder pressed against her chest, the way a person holds something they have protected for a very long time. Do-hyun's lips moved before the rest of him caught up. Naomi. 25 years earlier, that name had belonged to a homeless child standing alone in a broken road, refusing to be afraid of him. Tonight, it belonged to someone this tribunal had no category for, and the story of how those 2 versions of her connected would take much longer to tell than the space of one courtroom morning allowed. He had come from a meeting that ended with a man's fingers broken over a lie that would have cost the organization $11 million. Do-hyun did not particularly enjoy violence. He understood, simply, that in his world weakness was a language everyone spoke fluently, and he had trained himself decades earlier never to speak it in front of anyone who might repeat it. The convoy moved slowly through a demolition district on the city's outer edge, a stretch of condemned buildings and empty lots where nothing living was supposed to remain. Rain had softened the dirt into something closer to mud. The headlights of the lead car caught something small standing directly in the center of the road, and the driver braked hard enough to throw Do-hyun forward against his seatbelt. A girl stood there. She could not have been older than 8, dressed in clothes too thin for the season, her hair matted from sleeping outdoors. She held a rusted metal lunchbox against her chest with both arms, and when 4 black cars surrounded her from every direction, she did not run. She looked at the windshield the way people look at weather they have already decided isn't worth fearing. Do-hyun got out of the car himself. His head of security would later describe it as the single most alarming decision the man had made in a decade, and he would say it more than once to more than one person in the years that followed. "Move," one of the men called toward her. She didn't. Do-hyun raised a hand, and the man went quiet. "Are you the man everyone is afraid of?" the girl asked. Her Korean came out careful and precise, the kind of language learned from books rather than absorbed from household, the accent of someone who had taught herself to sound like she belonged somewhere she'd never actually lived. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Then you're the one I've been looking for." She held the lunchbox out toward him with both hands, the way a child holds something too heavy for the moment, but too important to set down. Inside, when he opened it under the glare of the headlights, were photographs gone soft and curling with age, a stack of yellowed ledgers bound with string, and a leather notebook whose handwriting made the blood leave his face, because it belonged to his father, who had been dead for 19 years. "Someone is paying to erase your past," she said, watching his expression the way an accountant watches a column of numbers finally resolve into an answer. "My grandfather told me that if men ever came looking for these, I should find a man named Kang. He never told me which one. It took me 3 years to figure out it was you." Her grandfather, she explained, had once kept private books for Do-hyun's father, the kind of accounting no legitimate firm would ever have put its name to. Before he died on a sidewalk with nothing to his name but the same lunchbox she now carried, he had given her a single instruction and made her repeat it back to him, over and over, until it was carved into her the way some children learn prayers. "If men ever come looking for these papers, find a man named Kang." She had spent 3 years of her short life protecting a box of documents she did not fully understand, moving between abandoned buildings, changing the names she answered to whenever the wrong kind of person started asking questions in the wrong neighborhood. She had been noticed before. She had been chased before. Twice, she told him, flatly, without asking for sympathy. Someone had come close enough to hurt her. Do-hyun's security chief offered her money on his behalf, the reflexive gesture of men who had learned that money resolved most inconveniences. She refused it without a flicker of hesitation. The way people refuse something they've already decided is beneath the actual stakes of the conversation. "I don't want money," she said. "I want to know one thing." "Ask it," Do-hyun said. "Will you protect the truth in that box?" she said. "Or will you bury it, the way everyone else buries things they don't want to be true?" He had been asked a great many questions over the course of his life by a great many people who wanted something from him. Almost none of them had ever asked him that one, and none of them had ever asked it while standing barefoot in the mud, staring up at him without a trace of fear. He did not decide, in that moment, to adopt her out of kindness. There was very little kindness left in him by then, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. He decided, standing in that ruined road with his father's stolen handwriting in his hands, that whoever had tried 3 times to kill an 8-year-old child in order to recover those documents was not going to be permitted to try a 4th time. Keeping her alive had become, in the space of one conversation, his responsibility. That night, before the paperwork of her new life had even been signed, 2 men broke into the shelter where she had been staying under a name that was not her own. They were 3 hours too late. Do-hyun's men had already moved her. The following weeks tested a household that had never once been designed to hold a child. Naomi refused a room they gave her. Too large, she said, for one person, and too far from the exits. She refused the clothes bought for her. Too fine, she said, for someone who might need to run again someday. She would not eat food she hadn't watched being prepared, would not sleep with the door fully closed, and studied every member of the household staff with the quiet, exhausting patience of a person who had survived by trusting almost no one. Do-hyun, who had built an empire out of reading people in under 60 seconds, found himself unable to read her at all, and unable, for reasons he did not examine closely, to resent her for it. She doesn't trust any of us, his security chief told him, a week into her stay. Perhaps she never will. Good, Do-hyun said. It means she's paying attention. He had never raised a child. He had built companies, buried rivals, negotiated with governments that pretended not to know his name, and none of it had prepared him for the particular exhaustion of trying to earn the trust of an 8-year-old who had already learned, the hard way, exactly what trust cost. It was 3 weeks before she spoke to him again directly, and when she did, it was not gratitude. "The men who came looking for me," she said, sitting across from him at a table too large for the two of them. "They'll come looking for you now instead. You understand that?" "I do," he said. "Good," she said again, the same word she'd used in the road, and he was beginning to understand it was the only compliment she knew how to give. "Then we can stop pretending this was charity." He almost laughed. He hadn't laughed, genuinely, in longer than he could remember. He didn't laugh that night, either, but something in his chest loosened slightly, the way a door loosens on a hinge that has been rusted shut for years. The world's most feared man had just discovered, in the shape of a homeless 8-year-old, something more valuable to him than every asset he owned. The truth, delivered without flattery, by someone who had nothing left to lose by telling it. She grew up inside a house built of marble, private security, and men who lowered their voices the instant Do-hyun entered a room, and she never once let any of it change the way she looked at him. By 11, she had read every ledger kept in his private study, more than once, and had begun correcting the errors she found in pencil and the margins, without asking anyone's permission. The first time an accountant discovered her corrections, he brought them to Do-hyun in a state of quiet panic, expecting to be told the child had overstepped. Do-hyun checked the numbers himself. She was right. He said nothing to her about it, but from that day forward, her corrections stopped being erased. By 14, she was sitting in meetings she had never been formally invited to, positioned quietly near the back of the room, asking questions during the discussion period that made grown lawyers sweat through their collars. She studied, not because anyone assigned it to her, but because she had decided sometime in those early years that if she was going to live permanently inside an empire, she was going to understand every mechanism keeping it upright. Law, corporate finance, behavioral psychology, forensic accounting, governance structures most executives twice her age had never bothered to learn. She found things nobody wanted found. Accounts that didn't reconcile with their stated purpose. Signatures dated a day earlier than the transactions they authorized. Shell companies that existed on paper and nowhere else. Every discrepancy she brought directly to her father, delivered without softness, without apology, and without the slightest concern for whether the truth was convenient. Nobody in the organization liked her for it. Do-hyun did. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by men who agreed with him because disagreement, in his world, was dangerous, sometimes literally. It took him years to notice that his daughter's honesty was the only thing in his life he had never had to purchase, threaten, or extract. She simply told him the truth, every time, because the alternative had never occurred to her as an option. "You could learn to be feared," he told her once, watching her dismantle a supplier's fraudulent invoice in under 4 minutes flat, the numbers laid bare on the table between them like a confession. "You choose to be right instead. That's rarer and more dangerous. Fear runs out eventually, she said, not looking up from the page. Being right doesn't. It was during these years, while Naomi sharpened herself into something the organization had no name for, that Do-hyun formally adopted a second child. A distant cousin's orphaned son, 12 years old at the time, quiet and unusually composed for his age. His name was Co. Jaemin. He remembered everyone's coffee order without being told twice. He absorbed insults without ever raising his voice in response. He solved small disputes between staff before they reached Do-hyun's desk at all, and did it with a gentleness that made people relax around him instinctively. Executives who distrusted everyone else in the household found, somehow, that they trusted him completely. Naomi did not. People who never disagree with you aren't loyal, she told her father one evening. Watching Jaemin quietly talk two department heads out of an argument that should have taken hours to resolve and took him 10 minutes instead. They're just waiting to see which version of you turns out to be useful. Do-hyun laughed the comment off as the ordinary friction of two children competing for one parent's limited attention. He did not consider, even briefly, that his daughter's instincts about people had never once been wrong about anything else in the years he'd known her. It was the first mistake he made on purpose, though he wouldn't understand that phrase, or its weight, for another 2 decades. Their disagreements never became distance, not in those early years. She still sat with him at the end of long days, reviewing whatever crisis had consumed his week. He still asked her opinion before signing documents that mattered, even when he suspected she'd tell him something he didn't want to hear. But a fault line had opened quietly beneath the household, running just below the surface of ordinary family life, and neither of them yet understood how far down it went. It was on an unremarkable night, while reviewing a transaction that had no reasonable explanation attached to it, that Naomi found something she had not gone looking for. A signature on an international transfer that should not have existed at all. A company nobody in the organization had authorized, moving money through a route that made no operational sense. The signature belonged to Jaemin. She stared at it for a long time before she showed anyone. Not because she doubted what she was looking at, but because some part of her already understood that showing it to her father would be the moment their family stopped being one thing and started becoming another. Jaemin became indispensable the way water becomes indispensable, quietly, gradually, until the thought of removing him felt not just difficult but unthinkable. He solved crises before they had the chance to become public embarrassments. He volunteered for the parts of the business too tedious for anyone ambitious to want. International transfers, offshore structuring, the audits nobody else had the patience to sit through line by line. Executives who had spent years distrusting one another found, almost without noticing when it happened, that they all trusted him completely. He never lost his composure in a meeting. He never made a mistake that anyone could later point to and hold against him. Naomi began investigating him the only way she knew how, quietly, methodically, refusing to accuse him of anything until she had proof solid enough to survive scrutiny. Every time she believed she was close to a pattern, something shifted just out of reach. Files she'd flagged were reorganized before she could return to them. Numbers that hadn't matched the week before matched perfectly the next time she checked. She brought her concerns to her father directly, laying out every anomaly she'd found with the same clinical precision she used on everything else. For the first time in her life, he did not take her side. "You're building a case against the one person in this family who has never once given me a reason to doubt him," Do-hyun said. "Out of a single signature you can't fully explain. A signature that shouldn't exist," she said. "Nothing in this business exists cleanly on paper, Naomi. That's the entire point of how it survives." It was the first argument between them that did not end with some form of resolution. She left his study that night understanding, with total clarity for the first time, that her father's trust in Jaemin had never been built on evidence at all. It was built on the simplest, most human comfort. There was the comfort of being agreed with day after day, by someone who never once made him feel challenged. And comfort, she knew better than almost anyone raised in that house, was the easiest thing in the world to manufacture on purpose. Jae-min, for his part, gave her no reason to escalate the conflict publicly. He was unfailingly warm toward her in front of others, quick to compliment her intelligence, careful never to let their private tension become visible to the staff. It made confronting him even harder. Every accusation she raised behind closed doors looked, from the outside, like jealousy from a daughter unwilling to share her father's attention. He continued his quiet ascension. Board seats followed. Signing authority followed after that. Access to accounts that had once required 3 separate layers of approval collapsed, over the span of a few years, into his hands alone. Nobody voted against his advancement, because nobody had ever personally witnessed him do anything worth voting against. The family, without either side formally declaring it, had split along an invisible seam. A father who had built his entire worldview around the value of loyalty, and a daughter who had built hers around the value of evidence, and no room left between the two positions for both of them to be right. One evening, without warning or negotiation, Naomi told her father she was leaving Korea. "For how long?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Where?" "I can't tell you that either." He asked her to stay, the closest he had ever come, in her memory, to sounding afraid of something. She told him the only way she could protect what actually mattered, to him, to the family, to the truth she had spent years chasing through his own ledgers, was from somewhere neither Jae-min nor anyone else in that house could reach her. Neither of them, standing in that study that night, fully understood what she meant. It would take 10 years for either of them to find out. She disappeared the way a stone disappears into water, a small, quiet sound, and then nothing at all. No phone calls, no visits. One letter, 2 lines long, delivered to her father alone. "Please don't look for me. It will ruin what I'm building." The tabloids constructed their own version of the story within months, and it spread faster than anything true ever could have. The ungrateful daughter. The girl who had taken an empire's education and walked away from the man who gave it to her without so much as a goodbye. Inside the organization itself, the story calcified into something colder. She had betrayed the family. Staff whispered to each other, the same way outsiders always eventually did, no matter how long they'd been treated as family first. The truth was a decade longer, and far more deliberate than anyone imagined. Naomi built 4 separate identities over those 10 years, each one constructed with the same exhausting patience she had once used to correct ledgers in pencil at 11 years old. She worked, under names that weren't hers, inside international financial crime task forces and anti-money laundering units scattered across 3 countries. For 18 months, under her most carefully built identity, she worked inside the very government agency that would one day assemble a case against her father's holding companies. She sat in briefings about organizations she knew intimately from the inside, took notes on investigative methods she would need to counter one day, and said nothing that would ever connect the quiet, competent junior analyst in the room to the girl who had once stood in a demolition road holding a rusted lunchbox. She was not running from the empire. She was studying from every possible angle exactly how a modern state dismantles one, piece by piece, account by account, so that when her moment finally came, she would know precisely which pieces to defend and which pieces to sacrifice. She let the world believe she had abandoned her father completely. There was one person in particular she needed to believe it without a single doubt. While she vanished, Jae-min consolidated. Quietly, patiently, he absorbed departments that no longer had anyone left to challenge his decisions. He restructured supply chains, financial instruments, and internal reporting lines over the span of years until very few remaining executives could say, with real confidence, who actually controlled what anymore. Every restructuring looked, on the surface, like modernization, efficient, forward-thinking, exactly what a struggling old-world organization needed to survive into a new decade. Underneath that surface, it was architecture, a structure being built brick by invisible brick to collapse on command the moment he decided it should. Do-hyun waited for his daughter through the entire decade, though he told almost no one. Each year, on the anniversary of the day she disappeared, he had her old room cleaned and aired as though she might walk back through the door that same week. He never spoke her name in board meetings. He kept a single photograph of her in his study, turned slightly away from the door, where visitors wouldn't notice it, but he would see it every time he sat down. It was near the end of that decade that he first began noticing, with his own eyes rather than his daughter's old warnings, which he had long since buried under grief and a stubborn refusal to revisit, that the numbers across several major divisions had stopped making sense. Not dramatically, not all at once, just small enough discrepancies scattered across enough departments that a lesser man might never have noticed the pattern at all. Someone inside his own empire, someone close enough to have unrestricted access, had been dismantling it patiently for years. He did not yet know who. He would spend the next several months finding out. And the answer, when it finally arrived, would cost him almost everything he had left. It started the way every real collapse starts, quietly, in places nobody important was watching. A government investigation opened into one shell company, buried 3 layers deep in a structure nobody outside the finance division had ever fully mapped. Within a month, 3 more shell companies were named. Bank accounts froze without warning, some of them holding operating capital for legitimate businesses that had nothing to do with the organization's darker ventures, but suffered anyway, simply for being connected to the wrong name. Board members who had sworn loyalty for decades began resigning within the same 6-week window, each one citing reasons too vague and too similar to be entirely coincidental. Lawyers who had represented the family for 20 years suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts they had never once mentioned before. Old allies, men who had eaten at Do-hyun's table, celebrated at his gatherings, sworn debts of loyalty they'd claimed would outlast their own lives, became witnesses for the prosecution one after another, each testimony a little more damaging than the one before it, each one delivered with the practiced regret of men protecting themselves first. The media had a headline ready before the tribunal was even formally scheduled. The Mafia Emperor finally falls. What none of them understood. Not the prosecutors building their case with such evident confidence. Not the board members fleeing in coordinated silence. Not even Do-hyun's own security detail. Was that he had known for over a year that a traitor existed somewhere inside his organization, and had made the calculated decision to let himself appear weaker with every month that passed. He stopped attending meetings he used to run personally, sending deputies in his place. He let his hands tremble in public on occasions when they didn't need to tremble at all. He handed decisions to subordinates he no longer fully trusted, and watched, with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life reading rooms for a living, to see exactly who moved first when the throne appeared undefended. It was a dangerous strategy, and he understood the danger clearly. He was using the last of his reputation as bait, gambling that whoever had been dismantling him from the inside for years would eventually grow careless enough, confident enough, to step fully into the light where he could finally see them. He told no one what he was doing, not his lawyers, not his oldest and most trusted allies, and certainly not the son he could no longer be entirely certain he trusted, though he had not yet allowed himself to say that thought out loud, even to himself. Jae-min watched the same events unfold from a very different vantage point, and read them very differently. To him, every resignation, every frozen account, every abandoned alliance was simply confirmation that years of patient, invisible work were finally paying off exactly as planned. He had never taken a single one of the money he'd rerouted for himself, a detail that made him nearly impossible for anyone to profile, because a traitor with no visible financial motive is, in the eyes of most investigators, barely a traitor at all. He wanted something money had never been able to buy him, not in 20 years of trying, and he was close enough now to finally taste it. There were nights in that final stretch before the arrest, when Do-hyun sat alone in his study with his daughter's photograph, turned toward him instead of away, and allowed himself to wonder, briefly and only in private, whether she had somehow already seen this coming, whether her decade of silence had been less abandonment and more preparation for exactly this moment. He didn't let the thought linger long. Hope, in his experience, was a luxury men in his position rarely survived indulging. The morning he was arrested, there were no dramatics of the kind the tabloids had spent years predicting for a man like him. No standoff, no gunfire, no dramatic escape through a service corridor. Just two officers arriving at his front gate with quiet efficiency, a single set of handcuffs, and a tribunal date announced to a room full of cameras before he had even finished being processed at the station. He said nothing to the officers on the drive. He said nothing to the reporters shouting questions through the car window. He simply looked out at a city he had spent decades quietly controlling from the shadows, and thought, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain even to himself, about a demolition road that no longer existed and a child who had once asked him a question he had spent 25 years trying to live up to. Will you protect the truth or bury it? He was, at that moment, entirely uncertain which answer his own life was about to prove true. The tribunal opened to a courtroom with more journalists in it than seats. Do-hyun stood in handcuffs while a prosecutor built a case brick by careful brick. Forged signatures pulled from a decade of paperwork. Offshore transfers traced through accounts nobody outside the finance division had ever known existed. Testimony delivered by men who had once called him family and now sat comfortably on the other side of the room, calling him a defendant instead. Every witness who might have spoken in his defense had, somehow, already testified for the prosecution years' worth of documents that might once have helped his case had vanished from the record long before this morning ever arrived. Jae-min sat near the front of the gallery, composed as always, hands folded, watching the proceedings unfold with the quiet, contained satisfaction of a man observing a plan reach its final and most rewarding stage exactly as he had designed it to unfold. He said almost nothing throughout the morning. He didn't need to say anything. The case was constructing itself, brick by brick, and every piece of it pointed cleanly, methodically, and irreversibly toward the man sitting in handcuffs at the defense table. Do-hyun listened to the prosecution's closing summary and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so many months of dread, that there was no remaining version of this hearing that ended with him walking free. He had spent the better part of a year deliberately using himself as bait to draw a traitor out of hiding, and it appeared now, in this final hour, that the trap had simply closed shut around him instead, with no one left standing on the outside of it to spring him loose. He thought, in a stretch of silence before the judge lifted his hand, about a lunchbox in a demolition road, and a girl who had once asked him, without an ounce of fear in her voice, whether he would protect the truth or bury it like everyone else did. He had never gotten the chance to tell her that her question had quietly shaped nearly every decision he'd made in the 25 years since. He wondered, with a grief too old and too settled to show plainly on his face, whether he would ever get that chance now. The judge's hand moved toward the gavel. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head in the room turned at once, the way a room turns only when something has happened that no one in it was prepared for. She walked in like someone who had already rehearsed every single step 100 times over and no longer needed any of that rehearsal to carry her forward. "I represent the defense," she said, setting the red folder down on the table with the calm, unhurried care of someone placing down a weight she had carried, quite literally, for 25 years. Nobody in the courtroom recognized her credentials at first glance. An international legal strategist registered under a name half the gallery had never once heard before, holding a professional record built across 3 separate countries and a decade of investigative casework, most of the people in that room didn't have the clearance to review even if they'd wanted to. It didn't matter in the end. The judge granted her standing to address the tribunal before the prosecution had even finished raising its objection. She did not raise her voice once during the entire proceeding that followed. She never needed to. One by one, methodically, she dismantled the prosecution's case the way she had once dismantled the supplier's fraudulent invoice at 14 years old. A document here, a timeline discrepancy there, a signature dated a full calendar day before the very transaction it claimed to authorize had technically taken place. She produced financial records the prosecution had never seen, gathered patiently over a full decade from inside the very agencies now leading the case against her father. She traced every forged transfer, every quietly created shell company, every backdated signature back through years of buried paperwork, until all of it converged, cleanly and without any reasonable room for doubt, on a single name that had never once appeared on the prosecution's radar. Co. Jae-min. Do-hyun watched his daughter work, piece by piece, and understood, for the first time in a full decade, exactly what her silence had actually been. Not abandonment. Preparation. She had spent 10 years building the only weapon capable of saving him, precisely because she had understood, long before he ever did, that anything built too close to home could be discovered and quietly destroyed before it ever had the chance to matter. The room's attention shifted degree by degree, the way a compass needle shifts, away from the man sitting in handcuffs at the defense table and toward the composed young executive near the front who had said almost nothing all morning and now, for the first time, looked as though the ground beneath him had finally begun to move. Jae-min let the silence stretch a moment longer than it strictly needed to. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, the first unguarded expression anyone in that courtroom had ever seen cross his face in the entire time they'd known him, and said the single sentence that would change the direction of everything that followed. "You're still missing the biggest truth."
2 years since the boardroom that once ran with flawless, silent precision. Kang Do-hyun was no longer a syndicate leader. He held no title, controlled no territory, commanded no loyalty beyond the handful of old contacts who still remembered what he used to be, out of habit more than respect. He moved through Seoul now like a ghost haunting the ruins of a city he once owned, the same streets, the same skyline, none of it is anymore. He tracked down an old contact and asked, plainly, whether the man knew where he could find Arya Vance. The contact pushed back. Was Jin-woo looking for her so he could apologize, or so he could ask her to fix what was left of him? Jin-woo answered that it was neither. He needed to see her. That was the only thing he knew for certain anymore. The contact reminded him, bluntly, that he had thrown away the only person who ever kept this city from swallowing him whole, on the word of a woman who had turned out to be working for the Shin faction, and asked if he understood how that sounded. Jin-woo admitted he understood exactly how it sounded. He'd had 2 years to understand it. He spent his last remaining favors the way a man spends his last coins, carefully, deliberately, each one a small admission of how little he had left. He was no longer the arrogant king who dismissed loyalty as a given. He had become something else, a man stripped down to the bare architecture of his own mistakes, finally able to see, with brutal clarity, every place where his pride had cost him something he could never fully rebuild. He told the old contact he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He didn't think he'd earned the right to ask for that. He only wanted to look Arya in the eyes and tell her that he knew now, exactly what he had thrown away, and exactly why he had thrown it away, and he wanted her to hear him say it, even if she had no reason to care. The contact admitted that wasn't the Jin-woo he used to work for. Jin-woo agreed, that man was gone. He died somewhere around the time his empire did. Word finally came back through a contact who owed him one last debt, an address, a name change, whispers of an entity that had been quietly, methodically buying up the liquidated assets of the old Kang syndicate for the better part of a year, moving with a precision that felt, to anyone who had ever worked in that boardroom, unmistakably familiar. Jin-woo received a single message, no explanation attached, a date, a time, and the address of his own former headquarters.
"Whatever this tribunal ultimately decides about me," he said, still standing in handcuffs, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been all morning. "I am transferring full and irrevocable ownership of every company, every property, and every foundation this family has ever built to my daughter. Effective today, regardless of your verdict." The courtroom broke into noise for the first time since the hearing began. Even Naomi, who had spent nearly a quarter of a century preparing herself for almost every possible outcome this day could have produced, had never once prepared for that particular one. Her father was placing an entire empire directly into her hands before he even knew whether he would still be a free man left standing to watch what she chose to build from it. 3 weeks later, the tribunal formally cleared him of the central conspiracy charges. Once Jae-min's decade of forged paperwork had been fully unwound, cross-referenced, and entered permanently into the official record. Jae-min himself was convicted of financial fraud and extensive forgery. The panel, visibly moved by testimony none of them had expected to hear on the day they'd walked into that courtroom, recommended a sentence that acknowledged the wound quietly buried underneath the crime, rather than treating the crime alone as the entire story worth punishing. Naomi did not take the throne of a criminal empire that no longer had any reason left to exist. She had never wanted it, not once, not even during the darkest years of her decade away, when wanting something simpler might have been easier than the path she'd chosen instead. Over the years that followed, she dismantled every illegal structure the organization had depended on for its survival, one careful piece at a time, and converted whatever remained into something else entirely. Orphan homes, scholarship programs for children with nowhere else to turn, legitimate companies built on actual paperwork instead of buried ledgers, and community foundations that quietly, without fanfare, repaid families who had been harmed decades before she herself had even been born. The empire that had once made grown men lower their voices simply by walking into a room disappeared without a single further act of violence. It ended, in the end, exactly the way she had always privately believed it should end. Through paperwork, through patience, through a truth finally allowed to finish the sentence it had first started 25 years earlier, in the middle of a broken road that no longer existed anywhere except in the two people who remembered standing on it. She kept one object from that old life, and only one. Not the red folder that remained permanently sealed in the tribunal's official record, exactly where it belonged, exactly where the truth had always deserved to live. She kept the rusted lunchbox instead, clean now, resting quietly on a shelf inside an office that had once belonged to a man the entire underworld had feared and now belonged, without contradiction, to the only person who had never once been afraid of him at all. The little girl who had once stood alone in the dark, refusing to move until someone finally gave her a truthful answer, had grown into the one person strong enough to make certain no other child would ever again have to stand in a road like that, waiting for someone powerful enough to finally listen. The greatest legacy Kang Do-hyun ever left behind was never the empire he built in fear. It was the daughter brave enough, 25 years later, to walk back into a courtroom and end it, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with the truth he had once promised, in the mud, under headlights, that he would never bury again. If this story got to you the way I think it did, if you found yourself rooting for Naomi somewhere along the way, that's exactly why I make these. So thank you for staying until the end. That means more than you probably realize. If you want more stories like this one, go ahead and tap the screen. There's a whole library of them waiting for you, and I think you'll find another one worth your time. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is me kindly asking. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it's the easiest way to make sure you don't miss what's coming next. One last thing, tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I love reading through the comments and seeing just how many places these stories reach. It makes this feel like a lot more than just a video. See you in the next one.